Hello and welcome everyone to the virtual forum on linking wild foods, biodiversity, and forest-based livelihoods towards an outlook of inclusive food systems in Asia to 2030. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Christina. I'm from Insight Pact, and I will be your technical facilitator for today. So if you have any questions about Zoom or require any technical assistance, please feel free to privately message me. Just a few announcements before we proceed. We will be conducting today's session in English, but we do have interpretation available. We have Tagalog, Khmer, Bahasa Indonesia, Tamil, Thai, and Vietnamese. So if you would like to listen to the session today in these languages, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the language of your choice. A very quick note though, for those wishing to listen in Thai, please select the Japanese language channel and you should be able to hear today's session in Thai. Another announcement is that we are going to be keeping the webinar format for this session. So to better track the questions that you might have for our panelists today, please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as well. That way we can also keep track of your questions in case we aren't able to get to them today. We will be sure to have our panelists answer them at a later date and put it up on the website. We will be recording this session as well. So to our recorders, please feel free to begin recording now. And with that, I am happy to introduce to you our moderator for the first part of the session, Dezel Labapis from NTFP-EP Asia. Take it away, Dezel.
Thank you, Christina. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone from wherever region you are tuned in. I'm Dazzle Abapis, and I'm Program Officer at NTFP-EP Asia and also part of the CSO Forum, a dialogue partner of the Wild Foods, Biodiversity, and Forest-Based Livelihoods Network Experts Group. I'll be your moderator for today's event. Welcome again, everyone, to the third main event of the virtual forum linking wild foods, biodiversity, and forest-based livelihoods towards an outlook of inclusive food systems in Asia to 2030. We're very happy that you can join us today. This event is organized by NTFP-EP in partnership with the Swedish International Agricultural Network Initiative, or SIANI. Our dialogue today focuses on reflections on the regional situation of wild foods across ASEAN and Asia, identification of areas of synergy towards a more enabling environment that would help strengthen our food systems and transform it into a more sustainable and inclusive one. The first part of the program, we will hear keynotes from three of our esteemed guest speakers. To start off, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Ramon Rizal. Dr. Rizal is a professor and former dean of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, College of Forestry and Natural Resources, where he teaches about non-timber forest products. He is also a trustee of NTFP-EP. Dr. Rizal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dazzle. A pleasant day to everyone. So as Dazzle mentioned, I am a professor in the College of Forestry and Natural Resources of the University of the Philippines in Los Baños. And I developed the course, Non-Timber Forest Products, in 1998 and have been teaching it since then, along with other courses and fulfilling other university functions. I also wrote a book titled Non-Wood Forest Products of the Philippines that has been used as a main reference for the course. At first, the course on non-timber forest products was just a specialized course, but we pushed and succeeded to make it part of the regular course offerings for all baccalaureate in forestry students in UPLB. And then a few years later, the Philippine Commission on Higher Education prescribed this course in all universities offering forestry in the Philippines. My mission is for students to see that forestry is not only about trees, but it is also about people and the other benefits that the forests provide, including one of humans' basic needs, which is food. Aside from teaching, I also do research on non-timber forest products, bamboo, resins, policy issues. And this has brought me to participate in the many initiatives of the Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program. I have not done active research on wild foods, but I participated in a local wild foods workshop attended by many indigenous peoples groups in the country, as well as the regional forum on wild foods in Tamil Nadu in India. I also helped Madhu Ramnath write the book Wild Taste in Asia, Coming Home to the Forest for Food, which documented available wild foods in selected countries in Asia, such as India, the Philippines, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Indonesia, as well as the indigenous people's practices in identifying, collecting or gathering, preparing, consuming, and sharing plant and animal foods from the respective forest lands. I think these involvements earned me my ticket to participate as a member of the expert group of this SIANI-funded initiative. In the past few days, we have been asked to share our outlook of inclusive food systems. Somehow I have difficulty with the term outlook, so I surfed the internet to find how outlook differs from outcome. Having embraced the philosophy that when you set out to do things, you begin with the end first, or the outcome in mind. And so what I found is that outlook determines outcome, that how we view or act on things will shape how things turn out. In our many discussions in the Wild Foods Experts Group, the issue of what's in it for poor upland indigenous peoples, the traditional users of wild foods, always comes out. So what this tells us is that we should always be reminded to avoid interventions that could disrupt, further impoverish, further disenfranchise, and further marginalize those who traditionally consume wild foods. We should put in place actions that must lead towards an outcome that will make life better for upland dwellers, not worse. We agree that the world is in a food security crisis, and this, I believe, is one of the triggers for this Wild Foods initiative, and that was before the pandemic. With the pandemic, the food security crisis has worsened. So while we take comfort in observations that our upland brothers and sisters did not have to fall in line for aid or for money to buy food, because they can always fend for themselves, as wild foods had been always there for them to pick. Let us not forget that perhaps this is also because they were all too far away, too remote, so used to not having the money for anything, so used to not being reached by basic services, by internet, by electricity. So the pandemic has made things worse for them. No online education. They had been further denied health services, as these are focused on combating COVID-19 in crowded population centers. No transportation in many places. Addressing the food security crisis is urgent, but at no one's expense. Certainly not at the expense of those who already have too little to spare. Not until there are safety nets in place. Not until the imbalance in access to foods and other basic needs is addressed. Not until food wastage in places who are growing obese populations is curtailed. Not until the deterioration of productive lands with non-sustainable agricultural practices on a handful of crops are checked. Not until the upland dwellers are secure in their territories and lands, which they have managed and conserved over time. Not until their voices are heard and paid attention to in crafting programs and policies that affect them and their future. The Wild Foods Network should provide a platform that will reach out to the world that protecting the last frontier, where wild foods abound, is everyone's best hope for a better future. So let us continue to pile on data, gather more evidence by properly engaging with our upland brothers and sisters, and by partnering with them in the conduct of studies that will redound to their well-being. Then we can share our findings with groups or with people who can influence decisions, those who can catch people's ears when they proclaim that it is in the best interest of everyone to take heed of indigenous peoples and their cultures. A further role to play for this network is that it should also strive to seek, nurture, and support people who will serve as bearers of these messages. Thank you, everyone, and may we have a productive dialogue. Magandang hapon po, magandang araw sa ating lahat.
Thank you, Dr. Razal, for those very good reminders of interventions that will disrupt and further marginalize indigenous peoples, and also gathering evidences and partnering with indigenous peoples and local community on various initiatives on wild foods. Next up, we welcome Madeleine Fogda of CIANI. Madeleine has a degree in pedagogy. She worked for 15 years in Mozambique with various development projects with capacity development and knowledge generation. In 2007, Madeleine started working with capacity development at SEI, and since 2011, Madeleine has been the program director for CIANI. Madeleine, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning to you all. Greetings from Sweden. I can tell you that tonight we have had snow, so our landscapes are totally white and frozen. Otherwise, Sweden is actually a country where we do rely or eat quite a lot of wild food, even though our society has another level of development, but we are still enjoying eating a lot of wild food, and what our forests produce are also important for our economy. Yes, it is really with a big pleasure for me to be here with you today. We started collaboration with this expert group about 2 years ago. We had no clue that there would be something called COVID-19. And we couldn't even foresee how it would affect our work. And all our activities that we had planned actually had to adapt to a new reality, some for good and some for more challenging. But I am so impressed by the work by this group and all the information you have managed to gather in the current situation. COVID-19 closed down the normal opportunities to meet, to exchange, to learn, but it also opened up new avenues. So I'm not so sure I would be able to participate in this meeting if it was not from a pandemic and new methods to collaborate and communicate that it has pushed us into work. And I do hope this will continue so that we can continue to have these exchanges and that we can participate even though we are at far distance. CIANI is a multi-sector network. We work towards sustainable food systems and nutrition, and we try to share information and raise information of what kind of foods there is, how systems can be more sustainable, how food is produced, etc. We have a long collaboration with the Tenny facility. I'm pleased to see that Nonette is here, so she maybe can also agree upon that. But I just want to say that for CIANI, tenure is extremely important, and it is of vital interest then to secure tenure for the communities in the forests and for indigenous people. So it's an important part of our work. We have also been very, very interested in wild foods and the importance it has for nutritious diets and self-reliance. And with the lockdown and interruption of value chain during the pandemic, I think it has become even more evident how important these food systems are. And actually, even though some groups have suffered a lot from the lockdowns, in this disruption of the trade, it has also shown that these communities have managed to keep themselves food secure with quite nutritious food, Small farmers has in many countries been exempted from lockdown, and it has given an indication on how important the small farmers are for food security. You have gathered a lot of data, stories, and also mapped out challenges this year. And I think it's now time to really see how you can bring this information out to wider policy contexts. It's important to bring food, wild food, on national, regional, and even a global agenda. To identify wild food systems, what are those? Is it possible also to integrate these wild food systems in the agroecology systems, for example? The Committee for Global Food Security will launch or will endorse, hopefully, a global report on agroecology systems, food systems, in June. And the contribution from wild foods would probably be very relevant as well. I'm not so sure it's in that, but that dialogue should be continued. There is also challenges ahead. Some of these products can possibly also be processed, and in that way also opportunity to make some business, but also protecting the forest. A good example of that is acai in Brazil, for example, a plant that has become very popular, but the people can stay in the forest. They can have a lucrative production and sell off the fruits with a profit. This is important to also create opportunities and income possibilities for the younger generations, for youth. You have in your work also worked a lot with traditional knowledge system. So this is a very important part of wild foods. It's also important not only tenure rights, but also intellectual property rights. It is important that those are secured by the indigenous people and the forest communities, and they will probably need help from organizations and institutions like yours. In Siani, we are throughout the year now promoting courses with the Swedish Authority of Registration and Patent. And maybe it would also be interesting for you to consider how to actually patent some of these fruits or plants and seeds for the future. Yes. So we are heading up for a year looking at sustainable food systems, and hopefully these systems can also be part of the global mobilization for Global Food System Summit. We are also starting the negotiations again of EPES. It has been delayed, and here is also where wild foods are extremely important in this context of biodiversity, so that we can ensure that we save and that we don't lose more of the plants and yeah. So yeah, we hope that we can continue to collaborate with you, even though this collaboration is coming to an end. But with the possibilities to be in online, to be in contact, we would like to continue to collaborate and bring forward knowledge about wild food. It's important it has for these people, and also to present and make it possible for you to present your findings in other audiences. I'm very much looking forward to this morning, and I hope to learn a lot. So thank you all for inviting me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine, and thank you, Shani, for supporting this very important initiative. And indeed, we're very looking forward to more collaborations with the group, with Shani also. And thank you also for reminding us that we need to bring out these gains, the gains of this initiative to a much wider policy context, even the global agenda. Next off, to also give his opening remarks and keynote, I am honored to introduce Giovanni Reyes. Giovanni Reyes is a Sagada-born Kankanay Igorot from Western Mountain Province in the Philippines. He is the president of the National Network Philippine Indigenous Peoples Community Conserved Areas Consortium, or Philippine ICCA Consortium, that focuses on indigenous knowledge, systems, and practices towards protecting ancestral territories that are home to the country's remaining forests and biodiversity. He is also a member of the People's Advisory Group of the Global Environmental Facility, GEF, based in Washington, D.C. Finally, he is also a council member of the Global ICCA Consortium based in Geneva, Switzerland. Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to our fellow speakers, to the participants and the public viewers. I thank the organizers for the privilege. Let me start by saying that there is no food sovereignty or food security without biodiversity. And there is no biodiversity without indigenous peoples' traditional territories. And without traditional territories, no wild foods. What points to this analogy is the stewardship role that have run through centuries of practice compared to a few decades old state laws on conservation. While indigenous peoples have spiritual relationship with lands and resources, governments do not. And this is exemplified by a recent landmark report by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. In May 2019, it said in its report, and I quote, "Indigenous peoples and local communities are often better placed than scientists to provide detailed information on local biodiversity, environmental change, and management practices, and are important contributors to the governance of biodiversity from local to global levels." Similarly, and probably we have learned of this already, the Deputy Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity reported about the failed Aichi targets, which he ascribed, and I quote, "The failed Aichi target is ascribed on governments not understanding the scale of the challenge faced by the natural world." And this is really not new, because the same decade, during that same decade from 2020 to the present, we have heard and read findings by the World Bank, by the UN CBD Outlook Report, and by the Science-Based Center for International Forestry. They all reported that protected areas under strict government protections managed by governments have lower biodiversity levels and higher deforestation rates than when compared to areas governed under indigenous people's traditional management systems, including ICCAs. What is significant about this about these reports is not what they are saying, but the entities making these statements. We now hear global financial institutions, science groups, and treaty conventions echoing the same sentiments that indigenous peoples have been saying since the 80s. If we look at the rate that forests in Asia have been decimated, for example, one tree is not every 3.5 minutes, or the size of 6 basketball courts, or at the rate of 119,000 hectares every year in the case of the Philippines, the furious ravaging stopped at the very doorstep of traditional territories of indigenous peoples, so that what remains of the country's forests coincides or are located within ancestral domains. Of course, as we are all aware also, 80% of the planet's biodiversity are within traditional territories or ancestral domains. So life would have been insufferable without indigenous people's counterpoint, which is one of resistance and hope. We need to look at all the determinants of wild foods and livelihoods, not only biodiversity, but how indigenous people's historical role have led to conservation. Let me share a short statement I made before the 27th plenary session of the United Nations Council for Human Rights. I said then that food production and distribution by indigenous peoples is about equating food systems with life principles. That is to say, life is not only satisfactory when food is available, adequate, accessible, and acceptable to indigenous peoples, but rather when indigenous peoples have access to and control over lands and resources within their domains. This control of resources have implication. This control of resources by indigenous peoples have implications not only with adjacent non-indigenous communities. In the Philippines, for example, some 20 to 25 million Filipinos, including lowland farmers, benefit from ecological services like water coming from our watersheds. Since 1 kilo of rice is equivalent to 4,000 liters of water coming from indigenous people's lands and resources, the alteration of indigenous lands into extractives means threats to the country's food sovereignty, threats to the indigenous peoples, but threats to the food security as well. Outside of the country, and in terms of climate change, we have mapped 167,000 hectares of community conserved areas, and we have documented it. This was analyzed by the Washington, D.C.-based World Resource Institute, which found out that the areas that we have mapped is capable of holding 10.5 million tons of carbon, or equivalent to gas emissions produced by 7 million cars annually. And that is just a mere 167,000 hectares. And the remaining the indigenous people's territories in the Philippines is from 5 million to 7 million hectares. Just having that safe, just having that retained as forested and not altered would contribute much to the future of society. The respect and recognition of indigenous people's rights and persistence of indigenous knowledge in combination with science should be at the heart of all policies and decisions, including our recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we would be enabling policy and practices that would help ensure a future acceptable to the next generation by simply respecting indigenous people's rights. Thank you very much for this privilege.
Thank you, Sir Giovanni, and for that very inspiring message, and for reminding us to have respect and recognition of indigenous people's rights, and it should be at the heart of the policy-making decisions. There's no food security and food sovereignty without biodiversity, and without biodiversity, there's no indigenous people's without indigenous people's territories, there is no biodiversity, and there is no wild foods without indigenous peoples. Just a few notes before we proceed for today's session. Today we are in a webinar format, meaning you won't get to see all in the room until towards the end. So as we close, we'll get the chance to see each other and say hello to everyone in the room. But if at any point you have questions or for our speakers during the presentations, you can type them into the Q&A box into your Zoom control panel, and then later on, if there are time, we can have a one-on-one question and answer. So you can use the raise hand function button in your Zoom account as well. We also have a chat box for announcements and general comments. And again, for technical support, feel free to send our tech host, Christina, in your chat box. With that, I am pleased to introduce Madhu Ramnath, who represents well the experts group on wild foods, biodiversity, and livelihoods, and the co-author of Wild Taste in Asia, Coming Home to the Forest for Food. Madhu is the country coordinator for NTFP India and member of the steering committee of the Wild Foods, Biodiversity and Livelihood Network Expert Group. He has been engaged in the subject of wild forest foods in Asia and is also learning about traditional cultivated food plants. Other related areas of interest of Madhu include nutrition, health, indigenous and land tenure, nursery, and reforestation. He is also the author of several publications exploring these subjects, and most recently, um, together with Dr. Razal, he also authored the Wild Taste in Asia book. So, Madhu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dazzle. And thank you, the previous three speakers, and your wonderful messages. And I hope to continue in the same vein. I'm trying to put together in this little time my views about what the food situation is in the Asian region and hint towards a common action plan that we could have. Yes, please. My first suggestion is that we need to speak from a position of strength. And till now, there is always a kind of apology for the indigenous view and always trying to validate it by science. We hardly question the kinds of mistakes science makes and are always put against with our back against the wall. Of course, when we speak against from a position of strength, it also means that we're in what we know, and it is also very, very easy to slip into this romantic view of the indigenous people, which will actually backfire in the way we speak, in the way we project our view. Yes, please. Could we move? And to kind of make our goals clear, I think I mentioned this yesterday, that our intention is towards the restoration of all this knowledge and food systems back to the people. That's where it belongs, like the three speakers before me have said, that we owe the indigenous people a lot in terms of knowledge, in terms of tradition, and in terms of holding back the forest from the kind of views and development that uh, we have forced upon them, the kind of development views. And to keep such views alive and vibrant in contemporary times is going to be a very difficult task. But that is the goal, the primary goal for the Asian region itself. Yes, please. So across the various countries, the country papers which we were presented with yesterday, one sees that there is a lot of knowledge available, and these are in different areas, whether it's sustainable harvest, the skill, the processing of various toxic foods, the neutralizing techniques, storage itself, whether it's drying, smoking, uh, and the kinds of baskets, the kind of underground storage. And in all these different ways in which wild foods are dealt with, from harvest to consumption, there is a whole lot of knowledge. And I often feel that we've just barely begun to understand it. It's a huge world in itself. And all of this is culturally embedded. So there is no clear separation between language, landscape, identity, the kind of spiritual connect which people have with food. And so I'm also trying to put together what actions we can take as I go along So it is not a separate section of action and recommendation per se. So we also need to understand why, despite all this richness, there is an overall decline in knowledge, decline in access, use, and the appreciation of food, especially in today's times. So there are two areas of reason. One is from within the society itself. Local youth today don't seem to appreciate their own wealth. There are aspirations which take them out. There is a lot of migration. There are also a lot of economic aspirations which delinks them from their own society, their own culture. And from outside, there are national policies like the expansion of palm oil, for example, in India, or there could be a timber policy, say in Borneo, or various other international agreements which hinder local societies, local environments, and local cultures. So we need to understand that the end is not but something. And this is also, there are overall shrinking indigenous spaces today, like was just mentioned. So that affects landscapes, tradition, culture, and identity. And we see that mainstream ideas, despite them being not so uh, valid in the way we think, but it is expanding. Fashion, mainstream fashion, what is considered good or bad in terms of food, the kind of fast food, and if you talk about food, or even aspirations, that is quick growing crops, monocultures, cash crops, mainly sun loving crops, whether it's banana or whether it's any other sun loving crop, which will deforest uh, to begin with. So values, foods, everything, these continue to expand. And indigenous knowledge, even though we in our small groups, maybe it's in the world order, it may be less than 5% of us who are talking about indigenous knowledge and we appreciate it. It is not something valued in the way we or the general populace values science. It is still something exotic, still something quaint. And again, we keep as if we are discovering something new. These have been going on for many, many centuries. But we still have to validate it as if it has to be equated with science. I come across the region, the same oversight in policy about wild foods. There is no mention of it. And there is no understanding that wild foods play a crucial role in indigenous diets. Every presentation about tribal peoples today mentions the COVID-19 and how these people were so resilient, how they could handle the pandemic. But it would have been very obvious. We don't need to have a COVID to tell us that. These were very obvious messages if you've been following these peoples. And of course, projects, interventions, none of these take wild foods into account. I mean, when I mean projects, I'm talking again about expansion of monocultures, whether you build a dam, whether there's a 6-lane highway, everything is to do with, these are the interventions which disregard food availability and indigenous spaces. Uh, that there are the idea that indigenous communities have the skill and knowledge to handle their food system is something very new to the state. They cannot even conceive of it. They can only think of mainstream agriculture, and agriculture over the years has removed or delinked food from nutrition. So agriculture has gone off on another path, especially mainstream food production. And nutrition has remained only with wild foods and traditional systems. And again, our mission here will be to counter this, counter these views, and get back to certain systems of food production or food collection. Yes, please. So I had mentioned this yesterday that this brings us to talk about all the food systems prevalent, whether it's rotational farming systems. Very often we have several endemic indigenous crops. the amount of pulses, various kinds of tubers, intercropping, and it's a kind of system which gives you something or the other to harvest right through the year. And uncultivated foods from cultivated landscapes is a kind of slightly neglected area, that even within very heavily cultivated areas, especially cash crops, you will find uncultivated foods which can be gathered. And of course, foods collected from the wild. So the one difference, I also need to go into the slightly the mood of wild foods. It is a very different mood with which you go out to fish, or go out to hunt, or go out to set a trap. The mood is usually upbeat. It is a happy occasion to go to fish, to spend a whole evening or whole afternoon by a riverside. It is completely opposite from the kind of mainstream agricultural farming system, where with a long face you need to go out to your field in the morning. So we need to think about the vibrancy of wild food too, and traditional farmings. Yes, please. So again and again, we have mentioned tenure. It's usually, it's only on paper, as I say, seldom fulfilled in spirit, often violated and always delayed. And it is the basis for ensuring everything else in terms of tradition, knowledge, food systems. And here I propose an action across the region, if we can all collaborate, to see what the status of indigenous tenure security is. All our governments allow something on paper, and all our governments violate it, all our governments delay it. So could we produce something towards an advocacy program, that this is what our governments have said, and this is what we are actually, and take it to a higher level of indigenous rights, maybe at a higher level, which can push this towards ascertaining tenure security. And this again, for action, for practical action, the link between wild foods and health is something we can establish. There are a lot of statistics which I find around health, about stunting, anemia, malaria, all sorts of things, but not much about the wild foods collected in different places, their specific nutritive values, at least the main ones, the commonly consumed ones, the most available ones, seasonal wild foods, and so on. And if we can put that together, we can fill in certain gaps. That is, the three things mentioned just earlier before I spoke: the availability, access, and consumption. What is it in different communities? And can we create tailor-made interventions? That is something we need to do. At the moment, it is very generalistic. And as I keep saying, we scratch the surface. And again, a practical point is, our key words are to do with health and hunger and indigenous knowledge. And we can link up to larger policy frameworks which our own countries or regions have committed to, and our own national commitments. And these are the main ones, like food security and climate change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. We can link up and gain more strength. Yes, please. So this was again mentioned yesterday about the danger of popularizing certain wild foods. We can see what happens with pharmaceutical companies preying on indigenous territories, intellectual rights about these, and all the different threats we have, where we may lose something, and we are actually losing something for the people. And we need to take a lot of care about this. And so what is it, as all communities are not on par with each other, especially today with respect to the knowledge, the access, and the skill, how do we rejuvenate certain areas of knowledge and access without endangering the resource itself? and how do we bring all communities on par. So we need to deliberate more on what we mean by healthy forests and healthy people. It remains a slogan until we deliberate on it. And we need to think and discuss this a lot and discuss practical groundwork that merges all these different food systems, documentation, and nutrition studies. So it is still a lot of work to be done. Yes, please. So this is my last slide, I think. So it is to do with discussions, stock taking. At the moment, what information have we across the region? Which countries lack and what we can do to fill it? What's missing? Short-term and long-term plans at all these levels, community and policy, and a clear timeline so we know where we are. Thank you for indulging me without that chime. Good day.
Thank you, Madhu. Those were very comprehensive points, and thank you for providing the overall framework that's critical for the dialogue today and even for the network that will be developed in the future. It gives us really some sort of a backbone to plan and work together. I hope our panelists will also give their reflections on the points that you have raised, and we will also encourage everyone to have questions. If you have already questions, please put them in the chat box, and maybe we can entertain some after the next presenter. So for our next speaker, we have Mr. Melvin Guilleno. Melvin is a Manobo indigenous person from Agusan del Sur and has worked with indigenous communities since 2011. After 2 years of implementing community development and empowerment initiatives with Aita communities in Capas Tarlac, he served as executive assistant to the National Commission on Indigenous People, Ethnographic Commissioner for Region 3. He is currently the National Coordinator for Region of the Sentrong Pagpapalakas ng Negritong Kultura at Kalikasan, or SPNKK, where his primary role is to strengthen the capacity of the network and provide oversight for the various programs implemented in SPNKK member communities. Melvin will share with us the journey of SPNKK and their indigenous-led practices and strategies to protect and strengthen indigenous knowledge and identity. I believe that there's a video prepared for us. Melvin, the floor is yours.
Hindi kami mamamatay sa bundok dahil ang daming pagkain na kalikasan.
Ang gawain ng babae sa bahay at pagtatanim, at yung asawa naman ay yung lalaki ay pupunta lang sa bundok na maghahunting.
Ang sabi ng ninuno namin, huwag ninyong iiwanan itong minana. Minana namin din sa ninuno natin. Dito kayo mananatili sa lugar na ito. At saka yung apo-apo ninyo, dito rin magkikinabang.
Ang idea sa pagganap ng mga agta sa Infanta ng Panupoy Festival noong 2010. Tapos nag-imbita sila dito sa Kakay. Kaya mga 4 na aitang ang nagdalo noon doon. Tapos parang nagustuhan nila yung ganyang idea. Sabi nila, sana sa amin makakaroon din ng ganitong festival. Doon nabuo ang idea. Tapos sa tulong ng FPE, Foundation for Philippine Environment, yun natuloy.
Discussions around the campfire, many women, some men, or on the way back from the hunt also joining, and it went on for hours. And indeed there I also brought in, maybe as a team, food from the forest. You can see, for example, how the sharing concept there is called mame, not for nothing. And like in our societies, sharing is still a very common thing. The whole event is 2 days. The first day is basically more or less an internal thing for the Aita to celebrate and to be proud on their culture, and particularly also one aspect, the tradition they have in food and all the skills that go with it.
Alagang natutunan ko sa magulang ko ay magtanim ng kamuting kahoy, kamuting gagapang, ubi. Ayun.
Ipakita namin po yung mga tanim namin na muros, yung kinakain namin. Saka yung sagin, saka yung liwet. Parang patani na niluluto, parang patani ron, pero hindi makain kapag pinitas mo yan. Basta sinabo mo, hindi mo pwedeng kakainin yan kung hindi lagay sa tubig ng magdamag. Kalot at saka yung iilo, nakakalason yun. Ang nagluto, hindi nila makakalason dahil naugasan ng tubig sa loob ng magdamag.
Yung pinapakain sa amin yung kamote, at saka kamuting kahoy, at saka yung amukaw, yung mayroong buto. Yun ang palagi namin kinakain at saka sagin. Kakain kami sa bulong ng amukaw, sagin. Yun ang pinapagkainan namin sa bundok. Walang palato.
Kami kumuha ng puso, hindi kami kakain o hindi kami mabibigyan ng mga produkto, mga pagkain na dala nila. Kaya kami, hindi kami mamamatay sa bundok dahil ang daming pagkain na kalikasan.
Food, what they still have here in the forest, is of so much better quality in terms of nutrition. So it would be really a waste if that tradition goes away.
Good afternoon to everyone. So Madu already discussed about the wild food, the challenges, and the proposed action. So in my presentation, I will just focus on discussing about the network and how it is connected to forest protection and protection of indigenous people's knowledge systems and practices. So what we are doing. So next, please. So the reason why I showed to you the video is because that food festival that was held in Capas Tarlac and other related cultural festivals organized for the Negrito groups is the reason why SPNKK was established. No? So SPNKK, or the translation for this, is the Center for the Advancement of the Negrito Culture and the Environment. So it's a result of reflection and sharing among Negrito leaders, wherein they urge the formation of an umbrella network with special attention to the Negrito groups in the Philippines. So the advocacy of this network is to assist Negrito communities to develop a national agenda focusing on the issues of self-determination, rights to ancestral domain, access to culturally appropriate education, forest food, and traditional medicines. So next slide. So I will not go into details in all of our programs and activities now because of the time limitation. So I will just focus in discussing some of the important programs that we have that has connection with our topic this afternoon. So the eco-cultural, can you go back please to the third slide? The previous one. So the ecological and cultural restoration. So the slogan for this is the healthy forest, healthy people, the healthy people. So it was identified as a strategy to restore the forest that was lost during the Mount Pinatubo eruption in Capas, Tarlac. So Aita communities realized the importance of bringing back the forest, of planting trees, not for the sake of simply restoring forest cover, but to respond to a felt need to restore lost forest resources, including bringing back the nuts, fruits, and other wild foods that the Aita women used to gather, and the animals that Aita men used to hunt, to provide for their food. So health and nutrition, SPNKK also lobbies for recognition of the role of the Negrito traditional healers in primary healthcare and promote healthy traditional foods, of food from the forest, through food festivals and Negrito community learning programs. So next slide, please. So livelihood, resource access, and conservation. So SPNKK also have this program called the Mobile Forest School. It's to promote culturally appropriate education. So unfortunately, as of now, it's currently postponed because of the pandemic. But the question is, which relate to our topic today, is that whether the program promotes involved wild food identification, learnings, and cultural revival. So the answer for this is yes. Mobile Forest School, it's a classroom without a fixed classroom, meaning the ancestral domain will be the learning venue of the students. So it offers curriculum with a unique blend of traditional and modern knowledge. So the curriculum for this are sustainable forest management, health and nutrition, sales and marketing of non-timber forest products, and then cultural heritage and education. So the good thing about this program is that the teachers for the learning process are the Negrito experts, from the community. So next slide. So cultural revival, advocacy, capacity building. So that are part of our program. Then it should be noted that SPNKK is a Negrito-led organization. Majority of the board of directors are leaders from different local organizations of the Negrito. So formulation of plans and decisions emanates from the General Assembly. And they are the one decides on their priority and the agenda that they would want to advance, in all levels. So as you notice, the center of the programs of SPNKK is on land and access to forest resources. So as hunting gatherers, the way of life of the Negrito is heavily connected to the forest compared to those in agricultural society. So as a network, we recognize the power of collective effort. So the representations of the Negrito, and that they should be the one defining actions, especially on issues and concerns that affect them. So I think this is my last slides. Last slide. So in order to secure and protect the traditional knowledge and rights of the indigenous communities, a combination of community and multi-level efforts would be needed, and there should be an generational transfer of knowledge, values, and skills among members of the community. So which is for me, this is a problem now that most of the Negrito communities are facing. Communities are now in crisis in relation to having a culturally rooted second liners of leaders. And this is one of the thing that we want to address in our program through the Mobile Forest School initiative, and find ways on how to maximize, because we have a lot of IP professionals. SPNKK also want to see options on how to maximize those IP professionals and to take critical participation for sustainable community and protection of ancestral domain where forest resources and wild foods are to be found. So I think that would be all, and daghang salamat.
Thank you, Sir Melvin. Don't have much time, but I think if there are any questions, I've seen none in the Q&A platform. So, this is the opportunity for the first part speakers to answer your questions. So if you have one, please type them in the chat box. If none, we can proceed now to the dialogue, to the first dialogue. Okay, seems very quiet. So maybe we can now, because we're running out of time, we can now continue the next part of the program where I will pass the baton to my co-moderators to take the reflections and journey shared by Madu, Melvin, Dr. Razal, and Madeleine in a discussion, and also Giovanni. So let me introduce to you Femi and Chrissy. So Chrissy is the Senior Advisor on Strategic Programs of NTFP-EP Asia. She has worked on community forestry and indigenous peoples issue for over 2 decades, with focus on community enterprise development, heritage craft promotion, NTFP development, participatory certification, traditional ecological knowledge, and local and forest food. Her field expertise is particularly on the islands of Palawan in the Philippines and on Indonesian Borneo, focusing on various NTFPs such as forest honey from native bees, resins, and rattan. Her recent experience extends to working with ASEAN on social forestry and MSME concerns. Her training is in business management and international development. Femi is our executive director at NTFP-EP Asia, and she also serves as lead of the experts group initiative on wild foods, biodiversity, and livelihoods. Femi has over 20 years combined field experience working with indigenous communities, management in NGOs, and advocacy and convening of regional multi-stakeholder networks around forests and natural resources management, governance, and livelihoods. So Chrissy and Femi, I'm giving the floor to both of you.
Thank you, Dazzle, for moderating a very interesting part of our session this afternoon. I think we have heard a lot about kind of the state of wild foods yesterday and also today, and also some promising initiatives. From Jovan, we heard about some frustrations with meeting internationally set targets like the Aichi targets. We also heard from Madhu about how rights are often violated and delayed. But we have heard from Melvin, who has explained about the mobile forest school. We've also heard this morning some interesting initiatives by IP youth and IP women in terms of sharing wild foods and protecting wild foods. So these bode well in terms of a promising, optimistic future, hopefully, if we can also have some interventions in the present and in plans for the future. So during this session, we will be speaking with some of our international speakers on the topic of interventions. So if we have a state that was shared earlier, then what now and how do we proceed? Interventions on tenure security and indigenous peoples and local community rights, biodiversity protection, and food security and nutrition, and their relevance to wild foods, biodiversity, and livelihood. Our first speaker is Nonette Royo. She's the executive director of the Tenure Facility. Nonette is a lawyer, practitioner, and a specialist in Indigenous peoples, natural resources, and land rights in Southeast Asia. Her work in Indonesia, Philippines, Southeast Asia, and Pacific region spans over 25 years. She has set up several non-governmental organizations with a focus on defending and strengthening Indigenous peoples and women's legal rights, and has helped design and implement funding portfolios for local communities and Indigenous people. So we ask Nonette in this, she has a short amount of time. Each speaker has 5 minutes, and then we'll have an open forum 15 minutes after. So we ask Nonette to draw from her extensive experience, especially with the tenure facility and even before that, on identifying some of the gaps in tenure security and rights, especially to customary forest, and maybe some interventions that you can mention in mapping the way forward on how things should go if tenure rights are to be secured, and eventually also securing wild food security and food security in general. Thank you, and Nonette, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good morning here. I'm based in Stockholm. I miss the region. I miss Indonesia. I miss the Philippines. So just to proceed, I have 5 minutes. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but it doesn't. I want to just dive in straight into what I'm seeing are emerging opportunities and also challenges. And I think the network here will have to decide, what are you going to focus on? Are you looking at and then the percentage of time on opportunities that are available, or the challenges? And they're not really separate, but I think it's important at this point for the network to choose, because the convergence of many areas where Indigenous peoples position themselves could really be maximized. So I guess there is I'd like to just probably point to share this particular section of my presentation. If you can see it, I'll just do slides. Just this one point here. So we work in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and the tenure facility focuses on direct funding to Indigenous peoples groups, no intermediaries as much as possible, such that they can work on land rights directly with their governments using existing regulations. So that is what is different with advocacy groups. We have to look for opportunities in government and use it, and work with the Indigenous group that is leading it. And so those funds are not small, they are large. So these average $1 million a year. So we have 14 partners right now in 13 countries, and each partner can get that for 3 years renewable. So what is the challenge I'm seeing is, for example, here, 25% of the world are indigenous lands. Yeah, just quickly, and the recognized portions of it are not much. There's a lot of work to do here. Now, the question for us, especially looking at food, is what do you prioritize when recognition is not there yet? But the positioning of the community is clear. Yeah, so what we see here is that, for example, in just the biodiversity and carbon map that's produced by Dinerstein recently, yeah, the area of terrestrial realm where increased conservation is needed is also in areas that are 35% of it Indigenous peoples. So what it has been said this morning, many said it very prominently, that Indigenous peoples' lands are where the last stands are of biodiversity and forests. So now what does that mean? For example, just as an example, for the tenure facility partners, there are more. Yeah, these are just what we happen to support right now, and the NTFP, you can map it all here. They are in the same places where these are. So that overlap is definitely seen, and the policies are lined up for it. For example, protect and conserve protected areas through. Yeah, and these are where taking advantage of what is available is a choice that needs to be made by the network, and the positioning of that is really important. And so we all know this, IPCC says the same thing, recognition of indigenous people's rights, the biodiversity, the same thing. Now here, carbon. So we know, I mean, many indigenous peoples have repeatedly said this, that carbon is just one among the many things that they protect in these territories. But this is the most prominent one, and donors are going in this angle. So how are foods linked up along with this? Because we know that they are not separated. Right, and so what has been so then I go back to the points. I don't know if it's already 5 minutes. When the maps are being developed, the communities that meet, actually, they know that they are looking at an outline of a territory, but they're also knowing land use, and then they're identifying the priorities of that land use. They're looking at watersheds, they're making decisions. The question now is, when this happens, how are we're doing it, right? But how are we translating what we're doing such that it influences the lowest, so subsidiarity, the lowest possible decision-making level of where that you can participate and position yourself, and slowly network with other groups that do the same. And I think that's happening. So now the question is, what opportunities? So the indigenous lands, yeah, we can see here, are globally important for conservation, globally important for climate, globally important for food. So where should we be? So these are just additional. We know we have more networks. Each one of us here in this call know a lot more. But this in COP26, there's going to be a big positioning that's going to be leading to a commitment for support and funding for indigenous peoples, for the Pledge for Nature. There's an ongoing food and nature climate dialogue for the existing forward partners. There is a very strong study that can be accessible. It will be presented this afternoon, but from the Rainforest Foundation Norway, of the scale and the channels for funding for indigenous people's territorial management. I can make that accessible when I get it this afternoon. The Just Rural Transition Network is also there, and they are essentially looking at food and land use, and the landscapes from forest to rural areas. So this is just one among you can get this later, but this is just a few of what I think would be an important area to look at for the network. So be opportunistic, but kind of use what we already have, and do not float too far up. Yeah, ground a little bit more on building what's available and accessible, and so the intermediaries need to see what the key roles are, and the lead should be the indigenous peoples. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nanette, and also for taking us through what the tenure facility is doing, and very much on the intervention of going directly and democratizing the funds so that decisions are made at the lower level, but also focusing on how horizontally indigenous groups and local communities can maximize the opportunities that are arising. And I'll take that up more in the synthesis, but to segue to our next speaker, to take from what you mentioned and what we've been hearing, that much of the biodiversity that exists in our forests, especially and in other places on this globe, are within indigenous territories. But much of this indigenous territory is not yet secure with different instruments. And therefore we have this threat which continues to exist. And I'd like to then call on the next speaker, who is a representative as the director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, and has kind of the overall eagle eye on what's happening in terms of biodiversity protection and conservation, to speak on interventions that are happening at the intergovernmental level, and also cross-sectorally, and what opportunities do we have there. But before I call on her to speak, I'd like to introduce her. Our next speaker is the Executive Director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, Teresa Mundita Lim. She is the leading the center, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, in facilitating regional cooperation and coordination on biodiversity conservation and sustainable management and use. She was the chair of the Convention on Biological Diversity subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice from 2017 to 2018. She's the chair of the 15th and 18th meetings on the ASEAN Working Group meeting on coastal and marine environment in 2014 and 2017. Her experience and expertise includes governance, management, policy development, implementation, and innovation, partnership building, science and policy linkages, and advocacy in biodiversity conservation and wildlife protection. So I think she's a very good choice to speak on the topic of biodiversity conservation and biodiversity protection, and the cross-sectoral work across ASEAN and in international scene. So before my son takes over, I'd like you to take over, Director Mundita. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chrissy. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. I thank you for inviting us to share with you some of the initiatives that the ACB has been doing and some of the possible opportunities that can be taken with regards to wild foods under the biodiversity sector. We have always recognized that, and as was presented earlier by previous speaker, Ms. Nonet Rayo, the biodiversity is linked to issues of wild foods and livelihoods and traditional knowledge and customary practices when it comes to agriculture. And so one of our program's main thrust now is mainstreaming biodiversity, which includes traditional knowledge and that is linked to this biodiversity, mainstreaming it into agriculture, to the agricultural sector. And in line with that, we have been collaborating with various regional partners with a mandate on mainstream agriculture. Through cross-pillar and multi-sectoral discussions, the ACB has been able to expand its network in the agricultural sector. Among the outcomes of the ASEAN Multi-Sectoral Consultation Workshop, which was held in Bangkok in 2018, that was jointly organized by the ACB and CIRCA and hosted by Thailand, the Thailand government, includes the identification of priority areas towards mainstreaming biodiversity in the agricultural sector, such as multi-sector and cross-pillar collaboration. Second, regional and national collaboration plans, education and training programs, raising public awareness, and case studies and consolidating best practices for upscaling and adoption. Additionally, Thailand also committed to lead the efforts of ASEAN in mainstreaming biodiversity in the agricultural sector. Thailand's National Economic and Social Development Strategy and Plan provides some entry points for mainstreaming in the agricultural sector. In August of 2020, the ACB supported the Environmental Policy and Planning Office of the Ministry of Environment of Thailand in organizing the National Forum on Mainstreaming Biodiversity Conservation in Agricultural Sectors. Uh, i- uh, Through our project, the Biodiversity Conservation and Management of Protected Areas, or the ASEAN BCAMP, under the ASEAN-EU partnership, Thailand also committed to support and implement projects on biodiversity mainstreaming in the agricultural sector this year. The ACB, of course, is ready to support and to work with Thailand as we have done so this time to scale up these initiatives at the regional level. Okay. This idea of biodiversity mainstreaming as an overarching concept that links the issues of wild foods, biodiversity, and livelihoods has been put forward in the last CIANI Experts Group webinar series in 2020, and this of course soundly resonates with our work in ACB. As I mentioned, this is one of our main thrusts. This was welcomed by the experts group, and in the third session of the webinar, biodiversity became the focus of the discussion, and there was a recognition of the challenge relating to biodiversity, particularly unsustainable practices such as the widespread land conversion in Asia, among other difficult challenges that are being encountered by communities living in and around buffer zones of protected areas and the edge of forest plantations. So the conservation and sustainable management of biodiversity in protected areas is one key measure that will ensure the viability of wild foods. It contributes to the resilience of indigenous peoples and local communities, most especially against the impacts of climate change, as mentioned earlier. A number of protected areas, of course, have are home to wild relatives of commercially important crops. Okay, so protecting our protected areas will also allow us to protect these wild relatives of commercially important crops, as well as and wild foods. So recently, the ACB has commissioned a study to document the various practices in the ASEAN relating to agrobiodiversity conservation. The study identified enabling factors which shaped and promoted these types of agrobiodiversity and associated multifunctional agroecosystem attributes, resulting in more productive, resilient, sustainable, and equitable agricultural production systems. The case studies from selected communities from Malaysia, Myanmar, and Thailand showed that biodiversity is closely linked with traditional and customary practices of the local people in cultivating and harnessing natural resources for food, nutrition, and to some extent, livelihood. Integrating biodiversity conservation within agricultural development has been successful in some communities, wherein state policies and plans acknowledge the local context and the traditional knowledge and the engagement of local communities in sustaining biodiversity in some of our case study areas. Okay. The ASEAN member states with ACB will build on these identified community practices as biodiversity in mainstreaming agriculture and agroforestry practices in the ASEAN region. So we will build on all of the outcome of the study so that we can further expand our work on mainstreaming biodiversity in agriculture. Through cross-sectoral collaboration with other ASEAN working groups, especially in agriculture and forestry, ACB hopes that these practices are protected and even supported so that they can be adopted more widely or recognized. The biodiversity mainstreaming in agriculture initiatives that I have mentioned at the opening part of my talk will also be considered for further scaling up among ASEAN member states in this cross-sectoral collaboration discussion. In addition to these projects on the ground and working with individual AMS, we also have the overarching mandate to work with the ASEAN leaders to take action involving mainstreaming of biodiversity across all sectors. So it puts ACB at a key juncture where it is now possible to engage with other ASEAN working groups in other pillars, such as with the senior officials in charge of agriculture and forestry. Well, in the Philippines, the development the participation of indigenous communities where the customary tenurial systems of indigenous peoples and local communities are recognized. Among them is, of course, the protected areas where they are part of the stakeholders, where they're part of the managed decision making board of the protected area. Okay, and part of the management effectiveness of the management plans for this protected area is the consideration of issues of equity and governance. And depending on the peculiarities of the policy framework in the country, the issue of customary tenure can be made part of the discussions. Okay, so what are the strategic policy opportunities? The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the need for more resilient food systems, which are sustainable, inclusive, and could be relied on during these events. So this crisis emphasized the critical role of local food production and consequently its link to biodiversity. Culture and biodiversity conservation are inseparable. So maintenance of the social relations that maintain biodiversity conservation is necessary. Customary tenure can also be made part of the strategic actions of government that integrate these diverse perspectives, particularly of indigenous peoples and local communities, into various approaches that are necessary to address the adverse impacts of various drivers of biodiversity loss, achieving multiple objectives. Addressing biodiversity loss and protecting traditional knowledge as well. Okay, so addressing these adverse impacts from addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss is key in ensuring the viability of our food systems. Cross-sectoral discussions are essential in encouraging synergies among these various groups and facilitate learning exchanges. The results of the discussions from our experts group could be shared with the various ASEAN bodies. Well, the ACB, of course, is ready to work with the experts group on advancing the cross-cutting issues of biodiversity mainstreaming in the various sectoral bodies and mechanisms of the ASEAN. And we will continue to strengthen cross-pillar and cross-sectoral collaboration in the spirit of an ASEAN that cares, prepares, and prospers. So thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Director Lim. It's good to hear about the progress being made, especially within mainstreaming biodiversity within the agriculture sector, which is being led by Thailand, and also the studies that you've mentioned that highlight the links between indigenous knowledge, indigenous rights security, and biodiversity conservation. I have some questions, but we will take them up in the question and answer portion. But it's good that we have some grounding to work on. Thank you very much, Director Lim. And now we move on to our last speaker for this session, Dr. Mulia Nur Hassan. Okay, Dr. Mulia Nur Hassan is a scientist at the Center for International Forestry Research, C4. She's the researcher for sustainable food systems, primarily trained in fisheries science, looking at fish from human consumption perspective. Currently a food and nutrition scientist at the Center for International Forestry Research, studying the link between diets and landscapes. She's also a part-time PhD candidate at the University of Copenhagen the International Nutrition and Pediatrics Group, doing studies on fish as nutritious food for Cambodian children. She's interested in all things food, nutrition, on the food, nutrition, and environment nexus. So we invite you, especially Dr. Mulia, to provide us also with some insights on the link between food security, nutrition, wild foods, and forests. The time is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy. I'm not yet a doctor, by the way. Hopefully soon this year. If you could keep this slide for a bit later in my presentation, Chrissy. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this forum, and I have been tuning in since a few days ago. I feel really inspired. Listening to the expert makes me think how much the movement can do and what we can do together, especially Nanette, the presentation about strategy. I would try to walk on the same path that today I feel like as a food and nutrition researcher, my task is to find the link from the knowledge that you've shared the last few days and recommend a pathway to advocate for wild foods and biodiversity from a nutrition perspective. I'm also going to base this talk on my colleagues and the study review that my colleagues and I have been working about linking food, nutrition, and environment using cases and examples in Indonesia. I find it pretty relevant to the discussion today. Indonesia, like other countries in South and Southeast Asia, is unique. We have more than 1,300 ethnic groups, and geographically we are the largest archipelagic country in the world with more than 17,000 islands. So our food cultures in Indonesia are originally diverse across the region, shaped by different natural environments, cultures, and history. And for centuries, our biodiversity has provided different food-rich micronutrients for local diet. And research shows that dietary diversity, or the number of food groups consumed, is associated with better micronutrient adequacy and lower likelihood of child stunting. You understand stunting is a great interest of almost every country in South Asia and Southeast Asia to reduce. And more recently, research has pointed out that the number of species consumed per day is also associated with better micronutrient adequacy. For every additional species consumed, dietary nutrient adequacy is increased. This points to the need to explore for the use of biodiversity in programs addressing hunger and micronutrient. The sustainable use of biodiversity has been advised by experts to contribute to food security and nutrition programs. The ASEAN Secretariat website stated that in 80% of ASEAN member states, an estimated of 5.4 million children suffer wasting or low weight for height, and 17.9 million children are stunted or having low height for age. While overweight and obesity and diet-related diseases are increasingly becoming a concern. But how many programs in food security and nutrition involving the richness of our biodiversity and local foods, or even targeting the indigenous people and consumption of foods? At C4 study site in West Kalimantan, we find that Dayak indigenous people practicing traditional agriculture consume more fruit and fish than people living in villages where oil palms were grown. And likewise, as the Papuan study site, those who collected and hunted in forests ate more fruit, fish, and meat than fellow Papuans working in oil palm. Those working in oil palm consume more processed food, which can lead to chronic illness such as heart disease and diabetes. In the oil palm site in West Kalimantan, the rate of wasting among children under 5 was higher than seen in traditional households. And in the Papua side, there was a higher rate of anemia among mothers working in oil palm compared with mothers working in traditional households. The study concludes that many of the wild foods can contribute to healthy diets, and access to forests may help ensure community consume more of these nutrient-rich foods. However, we understand that our agroecological system focuses on few high-value commodities and even few high-yielding crop varieties, limiting the varieties of food available in the market, leaving hundreds of edible and nutritious species underutilized, especially in Indonesia. The marketing and consumption of these foods, together with ultra-processed food, contributes to the transition of Indonesian diets away from traditional and wild foods and higher consumption of sugar and vegetable oil. On the higher consumption of sugar and vegetable oil, there's a study that actually covers Southeast Asia. Dietary transition and consumption of ultra-processed foods are associated with the rise in overweight, obesity, non-communicable diseases, changing gut microbiota population, and even we know now higher risk of COVID-19 infection. Indonesia, like many Asian countries, adopt the FAO 4-dimension of food security, which is availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability. However, policy application tend to emphasize on food availability alone and pay little attention to other dimensions. Like colleague from Indonesia the other day has shared about the rice dependency among indigenous people who use to consume other staple foods now that they are dependent on rice, while their land are not suitable to grow rice. And many locals now view rice as the preferred or the more prestigious staple foods because it's the imported food. And so what do we do next? Can we maybe show the slide? Yes, thank you, Chrissy. Recently, the high-level panel of experts report on food security and nutrition suggests that FAO dimension of food security, the four I mentioned before, availability, accessibility, quality, and stability, should also include two additional dimensions, namely agency and sustainability. Agency refers to the capacity of individuals or groups to make their own decision about what food they eat, what and how the foods are produced, processed, and distributed within food system, and their ability to engage in processes that shape food system policies and governance. And sustainability refers to the long-term ability of food system to provide food security and nutrition in a way that does not compromise the economic, social, and environmental bases that generate food security and nutrition for future generations. So you see that these two additional agency and sustainability are the new or the proposed dimension of food security to be added in the food security dimension that has been adopted by most countries in the world, including Indonesia and I believe in ASEAN too. So, in my opinion, this HLPE recommendation to add agency and sustainability into food security framework is an entry point for us, advocates of wild foods and indigenous rights, to get recognition on the benefit of wild foods for food security and nutrition and the environment, as well as livelihood of the local people. And together, through various channels, we could push the adoption of these two additional dimensions, agency and sustainability, by countries, member countries of ASEAN. It could provide recognition for the important role of wild foods and indigenous food systems. This definition I think there are two slides. Can you click next slide?
Sorry, we're a little bit over time, but I see you're on the last slide, so I guess you'll be closing your presentation soon.
I just want to say that these two factors, even though they seem to be like familiar to most of you here, but they're not very familiar among nutritionists. So it is our job to push these two dimensions into the food security definition that could be accepted by all countries, and therefore it will be an entry point for wild foods to be accepted by more wider audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mulia, for sharing with us the status and of nutrition and the relation of nutrition, food security, food intake, and access to forests. So the findings that those who are relatively near and can access forest food from natural forest versus those that are experiencing health loss or health insecurity based on their proximity to oil palm plantations is quite telling of the threats that we face. Furthermore, since introduction of the two different parameters is also very interesting and resonates well with what Nonette was saying in her first presentation. I'd just like to ask the organizers, since we are a bit over time and we do have speakers in the next session who I think are also limited with their time. What would you like to do? Would you like me to synthesize and then we do the question and answer for both dialogues after both dialogues are done? Maybe Femi, you would like to respond to that? What would be the best going forward?
Maybe I think it maybe reserve the synthesis and then we can both do it one after the other. So maybe I can introduce one of the speakers have to go, so we'll accommodate. But I think there's some relation in the two discussions. So let's stay on, and I hope the others can stay for a bit longer and entertain some questions after all the speakers, and we can kind of wrap up together because some of the presentations might be relevant and related. So if that's okay. Yeah. So I would be happy to bring in the three other panelists who, as I mentioned, would be rather speaking as well some related topics to what our first three speakers have already shared. And I would jump right in to call Esther Penunia, who is the Secretary General for the Asian Farmers Association. And Esther is, AFA is a regional alliance of national farmers organizations or farmers organizations in Asia and established in 2002. AFA is currently composed of 22 national farmers organizations in 16 countries, representing around 13 million small-scale men and women family farmers. AFA promotes farmers' rights to lands, waters, forests, and seeds, sustainable climate-resilient agroecological approaches in farms, fisheries, and forests. I invite Esther to speak now and share.
Thank you, Femi, and thank you to NTFP-EP and Shani for inviting us to your Wild Foods webinar. It is really pure serendipity that this webinar on wild foods is being held at the same time, also a week-long regional exchange on workshop between the indigenous people youth groups of the Dumagat Remontado in Tanay, Philippines, and the IP youth in Molo and Kesepuhan Pasir Yuri of Indonesia. And last Monday, the IP youth group have shared some of their traditional foods like sago, and as well as hunting for wild deer and wild hog. And the youths are saying, now we don't know how to hunt using the arrow, no? Because the elders have not taught us, and because we are now using the more modern foods because of all the advertisement. Okay. So the speakers before me this morning have confirmed the importance of wild foods for nutrition, for health, and biodiversity. But as you have noted, and as the speakers previous to me have said, there is also a challenge in preserving, continuing, maintaining, even promoting wild foods. And in our consultations, because at least a third of our members are in forested landscapes, we have faced these challenges that Giovanni Reyes, especially, and Mandu Ramnath has mentioned. And I would just like to summarize because it's very important on my segue to my next point. So the challenges that for indigenous peoples and local communities face would be access and control over the use of forest resources, eviction and displacement due to land grabbing, due to large-scale projects such as dams, and loss on protected areas which prevent them from using forest resources, degradation, deforestation, and forest vulnerability to climate change, poor physical and social infrastructure in forested landscapes, which the youth does not want to stay in the forest, and poor incomes and vulnerable markets. And when their indigenous products are popularized, they become very expensive, out of reach, and uncontrolled by the indigenous peoples. And then the mindset of inferiority on the culture of the indigenous peoples, and that's why the preservation of the culture is not done. So the question that was posed to me is what could be the convergence of actions that can be done. The first, the speakers on the dialogue one, we have learned so many innovations, so many interventions, initiatives being done to address these challenges. But let me just share with you what we think can be like the avenues or the platforms or some political spaces that we can use to forward our initiatives, to highlight our initiatives and to dramatize our challenges so that we could let the global community and the regional community and the national community act. First is that, as maybe you know, that there is this, that the UN has declared a United Nations Decade on Family Farming from 2019 to 2028. And who are the family farmers? I think most of the indigenous peoples are family farmers because they are farming, they are using the forest, and they are farming by their own labor. It's not commercial farming. So they all fit in the definition of the family farming. And what does the Decade of Family Farming ambition to do? It's basically to have an enabling policy environment for family farmers, because family farmers promote food security, promote healthy and nutritious diet, and promote climate change adaptation, biodiversity, and soil health. So there are 7 pillars of actions of the UNDFF at the global level, and all these pillars, I think, will be very important to indigenous peoples. There is a global action now that the task of the UNDFF Secretariat is to have national action plans. So for example, we are monitoring it because we are part of the International Steering Committee of the UNDFF. So far what we heard is that Myanmar, Philippines is undergoing good progress already in the drafting of the National Action Plan. Also Bangladesh. No? So we could look into this space of UNDFF. Of course, the UNDFF is the accelerator to the SDG. When we implement the NDFF in a very effective manner, we think that the SDG, especially SDG 2, which is touted to be the SDG least likely to succeed, we think that it will be achieved now with the implementation of the UNDFF. The second is there is a Food System Summit, as you may know. A Food System Summit is also being called as a People Summit, as an Action Summit, and its main agenda is how to transform our food system so that it will be inclusive, it will be just, it will be healthy, it will be nutritious. No? There are 5 action tracks already identified, and in each action track, there are all the scientific evidence of why this action track promote transformative food systems is being presented. So the study, for example, that was presented maybe can be forwarded into this action track. One is on nutritious food for all. We're saying wild foods is nutritious. Second is sustainable consumption patterns. Third is boost nature positive production. Fourth is advance equitable livelihoods. And fifth is build resilience. We have scientific studies on this. We have initiatives on these 5 action tracks put it there, because then we can, if it's recognized, we can further upscale it. Next is the World Forestry Congress. NTFP and AFA are working for our stronger participation in the World Forestry Congress. There are 6 teams, and we are working on the theme on green pathway to growth and sustainability. That's about livelihoods and markets, then forests and human health, and then enhancing management and cooperation. And lastly, there is the ASEAN Guidelines on Responsible Agro-Investments and ASEAN Guidelines on Social Forestry, which we can use whenever we want to promote policies that will promote the rights of the farmers and indigenous peoples with regards to rights to forest lands. So thank you, Femi.
Thank you, Esther, for sharing those opportunities and also for encouraging convergence or alliance between the farmers organizations and also wild food gatherers, and you yourself within your own network. You see also that overlapping aspirations, challenges, and also plans. So I hope we can see further collaboration, and especially on the advocacy front. We shall see each other, I'm sure. I will move to the next couple of speakers, but I'll introduce first Dian. Dian Sukmajaya. He's the Senior Officer at the Food, Agriculture, and Forestry Division of the ASEAN Secretariat. He's an experienced agriculture specialist with a background and experience in sustainable development, forest management, biodiversity, rural development, and natural resources management, and has also worked in the NGO sector. He has an MSc in Natural Resources Policy and Management from Wageningen University and a Bachelor's in Forestry from the Institute Pertanian Bogor, IPB. So Dian, I hope you can give us a bit of your perspective and also some openings, policy openings that you see from your vantage point at the ASEAN Secretariat after hearing also this many discussions and cases and points coming from the network that also espouses strong traditional knowledge-based support and also cultivation of that and security of that traditional knowledge when it comes to wild foods. How is it relevant right now, as you can note, for the ASEAN moving forward, particularly in the areas of food, agriculture, and forestry? Dian.
Thank you, Femi, for your introduction. How is my voice? Is clearly heard?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So as requested by the organizer, by Femi, I was asking to briefly share about the regional policy framework and opportunities to promote dialogue on wild food in ASEAN at the regional level, of course. So yesterday, I learned several presentations, country presentation cases, and I observed that there were various views of defining wild foods at this point, and not only defining the wild food, but also scope and its boundaries. And indeed, it reflects what is at the regional level. So I would like to be frank speaking that at regional level, there has yet defined wild food nor dialogue regarding this. So what we know well actually at this point is non-timber forest product. In that regard, in this context, throughout my talks and presentation, most likely I will touch upon wild food within the context of non-timber forest products. Wild food most likely are NTFPs, but NTFPs are not always wild food. That is the learning point from my observation from previous presentation. I will cover policy guidance, regional windows, as well as challenge, perhaps also several opportunities for discussion. As this food areas actually cross-sectoral in nature, as also touched upon by the Executive Director Mundita, under our economic blueprint, which cover 5 characteristics, including integrated and cohesive economy, competitive, innovative, and dynamic ASEAN, enhanced connectivity, a resilient, inclusive, people-centered, and people-centered ASEAN, and also global ASEAN. And this area also might be cross-path with the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Blueprint 2025, which address the enhanced cross-sectoral and cross-pillar coordination in ensuring food adequacy and accessibility at the household level. And further, ASEAN has elaborated the vision and strategic plan for food, agriculture, and forestry 2016-2025 that mentioned competitive, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable food, agriculture, forestry sector, integrated with global economy based on single market, production base, contributing to food, nutrition security, and prosperity in the ASEAN community. And then the other framework is vision and strategic plan of action for ASEAN cooperation in forestry 2016-2025, where ASEAN member state has developed vision for forest resources are sustainably managed at the landscape level to meet societal needs, both socioeconomic, culturally, of the present and future generation, and to contribute positively to sustainable development. Regarding food, also ASEAN has developed since 2009 the ASEAN Integrated Food Security Framework as a response of food price hikes at that time, and also its strategic plan of action. In terms of food security, ASEAN also in view that food security not only availability of food itself, but also accessibility, affordability, and stability utilization. The framework aims to ensure long-term food security and improve the livelihood of farmers in ASEAN, and focusing at the moment on 4 commodities, which are rice, sugar, soybean, maize, soybean, rice, and maize, and cover 5 strategic thrusts, including food security, promote conducive food market and trade, strengthen integrated food security, promote sustainable food production, and encourage greater investment in food agriculture based industry to enhance food security. And then what are the existing regional policy? Previously, Esther already mentioned about the ASEAN guideline for promoting responsible investment in food, agriculture, forestry that might be also relevant with this wide food dialogue. And then with the support of the NTFP-EP, the ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry has developed ASEAN guideline for sustainable harvest and resource management protocol for selected NTFP, including honey, resin, fruits, rattan, bamboo. I think most of them actually can be considered as wild foods, food that coming from the forest. These guidelines actually aim to promote awareness and on the value of sustainable resource management practices and importance of sustainable harvest protocols and promote sustainable management of NTFP. And the other is ASEAN guidelines for agroforestry development, aiming to promote the role of agroforestry and achieving economic, environmental, and social outcome of at farm household level and also at landscape level. And then these are some windows to discuss wildlife food or non-timber forest product in ASEAN. As I mentioned earlier, under the IISF framework, there is a window where one of measures including food diet diversification as an alternative diet or staple food for people in ASEAN, aside of those 4 main commodities under this framework at this point. And then there is also working group on forest product development, where we discuss non-timber forest product and also promote competitiveness of the NTFP to meet market requirements and trade facilitation. And then we have also social forestry working group. We discuss also NTFP under this, most likely on the wild food management system. And then the areas, potential areas for promoting dialogue at the regional will include exchange views on existing policies related to wild foods, within the context of NTFP, and then exchange knowledge and best practices in utilization of wild foods, enhance capacity to manage the wild food resources while also maintaining biodiversity. We identify some challenge for wild food or NTFP development in ASEAN. The first one is sustainability, as I mentioned earlier, regarding the availability, stability, access, and also challenge in deforestation. And subsistence versus commercial. Whether this wild food only fulfill self-sufficient or also aiming for trading. Because in a certain extent, commercial lead to forest degradation. And then the other challenge is tenure security that already touched upon by Nonet, and as well as behavioral changes. So young generation, they don't know about wild food at all at this point. They feel that it is too traditional, although it is actually contain more nutrition than the modern food. And then from diverse food sources to one or few staple commodity. I think those are the challenges that can be discussed further. To end my presentation, there are an opportunity to scale up dialogue on wild food within the context of NTFP at regional through relevant bodies as part of food diversification for food security and also improving wild food system management. And then NTFP wild food dialogue could also contribute to enhance people resilience to food price shocks. I think we experience in the absence of main staple food, part of resilience strategy in dealing with pandemic, climate change impact, and also disaster and other sort. And I personally identify that we need further study on to what extent the advocation work on wild food could go beyond while also ensuring sustainability and maintaining biodiversity. And also could this wild food also could provide livelihood for people in the region. As I mentioned earlier, it's also potential for an alternative dietary for local people. I think that's all, Femi. Our view. I want to share with all participants. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Dian, for again, just like the previous speakers, such rich information that we can tap. Hopefully, in the not so distant future, we can explore how we can engage the ASEAN Secretariat and your division directly to work on these policy entry points and guidelines. But Dian, I hope that you could stay a bit longer. I'll call on the next speaker, and then after this, we would open the floor for a few minutes for questions for the speakers and also for the earlier panelists. So the next speaker is Mr. Abdel Karim Sma, Lead Regional Economist at the Asia Pacific Division of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. In this capacity, he is currently supporting IFAD agricultural investments in over 20 countries. Prior to his current assignment, he served as IFAD's country director covering several countries in Africa and Asia. Mr. Sma joined IFAD after spending 7 years with the U.S. Department of Agriculture as agriculture specialist. Prior to that, he spent 8 years in a major international consultancy. Mr. Sma holds a master's degree in agricultural economics and an engineering degree in food processing. So, Mr. Sma, maybe you can take the floor and give us your reflections and reactions also from what you have heard so far, and share us a little bit more about IFAD's perspective on these issues. Oh, you're muted, sir.
Thank you very much, Femi, for this introduction. Greetings from Rome. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel and to be part of this dialogue on the importance of wild foods and the importance of forest-based livelihoods in the region. I represent an institution which is a significant investor into the livelihoods of indigenous people in the region. We have currently operation in 20 Asian countries with an investment portfolio of about $8 billion. About 60% of that money is really earmarked for rural areas and IP indigenous people livelihoods. So this is really a significant footprint in the region, working with governments, working with different stakeholders, using community-based approaches to make sure that we really invest in the rural space and make sure that the livelihood options of indigenous people are really valorized and thriving. Being the last speaker, I think I have the privilege of having seen and listened to all colleagues, and what really struck me in this, there is really a consensus about the importance of wild foods in securing food security, in achieving food security, and in making sure that those neglected and underutilized food and feed items would be really brought into the mainstream and valorized to their own right. So there is no doubt about it. But what really we need to think is about the lack of data. So that there is really, and I've heard one of the speakers saying about the difficulty to glean, gather, and compile data about wild foods and about forest-based livelihoods and about indigenous people in general. So I think as a network and also international financial institutions and other stakeholders in the region need to think about these data gaps and how we can harness digital tools and to be able to provide a steady stream of data which can be really mined and then converted into evidence to support policy making. The other point I would like just to highlight is the scale. So there's a plethora of interventions. There is many projects, development interventions, but it's really hard to get an idea about whether these projects, these interventions, these activities are really game-changing, are really making a difference in the livelihood of people. And so I think at one point, this network can probably engage into some thinking about scalability and what is the desired scale and where we stand, where is the baseline and where is the end line and where we want to go on really supporting indigenous people. So there is really this impression about fragmentation. What we do in IFAD is that we try to work with partners. We try to co-finance and we bring in other investors. So really to make a difference on the livelihood of people. And in so doing, we also engage with many networks and we engage with many practitioners in the region to be able really to converge all efforts towards making lasting impact on the livelihood of indigenous people and helping them really put forward wild foods and other non-timber products and then bring them to the mainstream. So that's my second point. The third point is also like I would just throw about the speed of all those interventions. As you know, we all aiming at trying to achieve the SDGs. IFAD is aiming at doubling its impact to the round to 2030. And I think there is really a sense of urgency in accelerating all these interventions and accelerating the policy reforms and the implementations of the reforms in the countries in Asia and elsewhere. So there is this notion about acceleration and speed. And then the probably the last point I would like to highlight is the importance of dialogues and the importance of of bringing the voice of indigenous people into the ongoing discussions leading to the Food Systems Summit. So I know that in the regions there are many country dialogues, there are regional dialogues, thematic dialogues, and the voice of indigenous people, the fact that wild foods are an important component of the food security in the region, is something that needs to be really advocated for and supported to be heard in these series of dialogues going across the board, across the world, and to make sure that the livelihood option is really well presented during the upcoming food summit. So that's in a nutshell what I wanted to share. I know that we're running late, but these are a few ideas that could be really picked up by others and then developed as we move forward. Over.
Thank you, Mr. Sma. Thank you also for giving EPED's perspective and about how we can engage and utilize the opportunities probably for partnership and resources to address issues of food security and also rural transformation and poverty reduction. I have some follow-up questions, but I would also invite first Chrissy to come back to the floor, and maybe the two of us can combine the next part of this session for a discussion, a short discussion. We are running out of time, but we don't want to miss the opportunity to at least have the floor to raise some questions from the participants and also ourselves to the speakers. So Chrissy, I'll start with you. Maybe you can start first.
Well, I see that there are some questions in the question and answer box.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We can start with that. From Carlo Lumban Raja, we know the diversity of food has a strong relation with the availability of land and the available environment. The main competition is between indigenous peoples and the state and private sector who have strong interest in land, where government is also facilitating large-scale land-based investments in the oil palm sector, mining, timber, and food estates. He is asking, are there good practices that can be shared by any of the speakers to show some win-win results, and especially where traditional wild food has been highlighted as a good alternative to reach food sovereignty? So I know we've lost, I think Esther and
Nonette had to leave.
Nonette have fallen out, but I know that some colleagues from ACB are still here if there are those who would like to respond as well. And I think that can go to the speakers of both dialogues, right, Femi?
Sure.
But
and if there are also others from the expert group and participants who are here that could respond to this question is also welcome, because it is about good practice. So if anybody would like to address the specific question on good practice, how to win competition and bring traditional wild food as a good alternative to reach food sovereignty. Maybe can I jump in and ask Mulia, have you seen any at least as a researcher observer, and you've also seen these spaces or areas that underwent transitions? Maybe you were not directly involved, but have you witnessed anything where they have addressed, communities were able to address these challenges and transitions, and this one, the competition between traditional wild food and food sovereignty in the context of your research and observations?
Yeah, thank you, Femi. I was afraid that you would ask me that. I think maybe, yeah, I agree. Maybe Nonette would be best to answer that. In my own observation, I haven't really find best practices, but also in preparing the food system summit, us, C4, and together with other CSO, we are collecting best practices. So I personally don't know yet. From what I have seen, is competitive, and but if you have a strong will local government, we can work from there, and that's where I lay my hope in West Papua, because the local government are having very good political will in preserving their forest, and so we will try to support that from there on. But I'll have to update you next time on the actual things that work from the field. But that's our homework for the Food System Summit, actually.
Yeah.
Amy.
Yes, Giovanni, go ahead.
Yeah, well, during the lockdown, the food security systems of indigenous peoples were amplified, especially in the areas of northern Philippines, where they recalibrated or they revived age-old traditions of preserving rice, for example. This is a concept where today's harvest is next year's supply, and today's supply is last year's harvest. So that during the lockdown, no one in these communities experienced hunger, unlike in the urban areas where hunger was more experienced. So there are many traditional practices of preserving food, especially in times of pandemics and calamities, even during wars, that we can study and try to revive in the face of the pandemic that we are going through. I'm sure that in Indonesia and in Malaysia and elsewhere in our compatriots, indigenous peoples in other Asian regions have familiar or have similar food systems in times of pandemic.
Femi, may I share a few words?
Sure, Dian.
Yeah, thank you. I think regarding the best practices, I'm not quite sure if I answer the question, but at the regional level, as I mentioned, we are trying to facilitate contesting land among the sector, for example, between agriculture and forestry, through the landscape approach, like the promoting agroforestry in ASEAN. So at the moment, there are 3 countries that already adopted this guideline, and they are developing the roadmap for agroforestry development in their country. I think this platform, the agroforestry, could be potential framework to accommodate the contesting land between agriculture and forestry sectors, while the land can be planted the forest trees. Also, it can also domesticate the wild food in this area. I see there are many wild fruit that features yesterday, also today, like wild bananas and sweet potatoes, wild potatoes, and everything. I think it is part of the effort of the regional dialogue to promote food security and also food diversification in terms of securing the better management, sustainable management of wild food and within the context of non-timber forest product. I hope it contributes to the discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Femi.
Thank you, Dian.
Femi?
Back to you. Yes? Who was that? Adimulya. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I think I remember something now. In one of the study that we reviewed was the Katingan Mantaya project. Maybe some people are familiar with that. I think it's one of the example where competition in land use could be managed, and where people are winning, and actually, like, there are reports that they are like livelihoods are getting better and so on. So I think maybe it's worth looking at Katingan Mantaya project and replicate where it is suitable.
Can you share with us just a short description about what that project is about so the others can have an idea?
Maybe I'll leave in the chat box.
All right, great.
Christine, you want to call Paul?
Yes, Paul. We were thinking if Paul Wolverkamp from both ends, and also from Forest People's Program and also from RSPO, could share. Maybe he can also help answer the question of Carlo on how to win the competition and bring traditional wild food as a good alternative to reach sovereignty. Paul, are you still with us?
Sure, I am, yes.
Hi.
So good day to all of you. Firstly, I was very interested to learn the study on the, let's say, the health impacts of palm oil dominated landscapes. So in fact, of course, palm oil expansion or any expansion of monocultures is at odds with traditional foods and diversity of foods. Let's start here. Now, in that reality, so yes, Bozens is member of the RSPO, which is this roundtable on sustainable palm oil, which is a contradiction in itself. I'm the first one to add. But Bozens made it a point that the RSPO should do more to reach out to local stakeholders and to give local stakeholders the tools, the capacity, the means to oppose expanding palm oil on their lands, for instance, through the RSPO complaints panel. So in fact, the RSPO allotted the $3 million to assist local CSOs, unions, women groups to play the role in raising concerns of local communities, but also of laborers. So in fact, the RSPO Secretariat has entered into contracts with a number of counterpart human rights organizations, for instance, ALSAM in Indonesia and SEPA in Malaysia, groups which obviously also work with local communities on land tenure issues, and in the case of SEPA also on biodiversity community protocols and so forth and so on. So this has sort of been effective in rolling out an awareness and capacity building programs in these countries. Other countries include Colombia, Liberia, and now starting also in Nigeria and Central America. So I should keep it brief, but this is in fact a good example where without any strings attached, indeed, capacity building is taking place and CSOs are free to sort of oppose RSPO members which are violating the RSPO standard. And the last thing is that the revision of the RSPO standard has as a main principle that companies need to respect community land uses, acknowledging the essence of food sovereignty and land use diversity. Thank you so much. And I can obviously provide more information if you like.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul, for that intervention. We will just have 2 more questions. Sorry for that. We are really running out of time, but one question for Mr. Sma. I just wanted to get your insights on the key points that you mentioned about scale and also scale, acceleration, and speed. After hearing all the different talks, actually, we've been going for the last 4 days. While there is a consensus now here in the dialogue about the value of forests, the value of wild foods, we've been talking about sovereignty, we've been talking about the importance of tenure. just wanted, and also of traditional knowledge, just wanted to hear your thoughts on, well, Nonat was talking about resources that would go directly to the rural people themselves, to the communities themselves. And we know for a fact that these are also quite difficult process. So and sometimes the programs at scale might not really be compatible with some of the interventions and recommendations that some of our colleagues have put out, which is a product of our discussions and intense observations and deliberations from the ground on the field. So I wanted to get your insight on that. How can we reconcile between the need for scale and speed versus some of the local realities, and which is also part of the nature of wild food systems?
Thank you, Femi. I mean, when I speak about scale, I just speak about the desired scale in consultation with the people themselves. I mean, we need to know what is the extent of the problem, and when we approach this issue, is both in terms of breadth and depth. So if the issues are really intertwined and complicated, we can't really solve them by just acting on one aspect of the livelihoods. So we can't really tell them you need to preserve the forest if we don't provide alternatives for them for income generation. And we can't also tell them that these are really important wild foods if we don't offer them opportunities to bring them to the outside and then to bring value to themselves. So that's what I don't see any conflict and incompatibilities between these two concepts about the desired scale and the need to preserve the environment, the need to preserve the livelihoods, and the need to make sure that these people are not really don't see the modern technology and the commercial agriculture eat up their space. So I think that's the idea I am advocating for. The second point is about resources. Of course, I think there is a shortage of resources. I mean, investment caps are huge in those areas, and for that, just to be able to attract resources, you need really to bring a vision, and you need to know where we're going. And you need also to minimize the transaction costs for the communities themselves. I mean, if you get multiple aid programs, multiple interventions, etc., you would really spread thinly the effort of these people, and probably kind of divert their attention from other important things. So dealing with all these issues, with these programs, comes with a cost for these communities, and this is the idea about having some sort of harmonization, some sort of priority setting among all the people working on these issues and the development industry itself, to make sure we're really making the right approach and we are really making the right interventions. So these are the two ideas I wanted to push for. I think the point about policy and practice, which is the theme of the dialogue today, these are two notions which are really linked to each other. When we work with the indigenous people, we need also to work on with policymakers in order to make sure that we secure access to land, we secure access to natural resources, and these are lengthy processes. Cumbersome, need a lot of follow-ups. And sometimes the indigenous people themselves, they are ill-equipped for that. So this policy aspect is really important, in addition to the practice itself, to the development interventions that we bring in situ. So these are the two notions. But again, I think this kind of discussion and bringing together all these practitioners today or during this week-long event is really an important thing for us to see what is the status of the practice, but also to think for what are the opportunities and what we can do collectively achieve together. And again, and I see this as really feeding into this series of discussions leading to the Food Systems Summit and other important events. Over.
Thank you, Mr. Sma, for that clarification and also further elaborating on really the synchronicity. You need to really be synchronized in terms of strategies and enabling policy, and also making sure that the practice is also, there's also interventions and strategies targeted to improving practice and supporting or protecting current practices as far as like wild foods is concerned. Chrissy, do we have, okay, so one of the questions that we were going to ask, Mulia is already responding, so we also encourage the other speakers, if you see some questions, there are still 3 open questions. Some of them are actually merged and are comments, but we encourage the speakers to leave an answer for our participants, so we can address everything, but just respond in writing. So maybe Chrissy, I'll turn over to you again, and we can close the two merged discussions.
Yeah, yes. So it's been a good 2.5 hours. I'll try to make this short because many things have been discussed and also underlined in the discussion. From the dialogue 1, I can say broadly that opportunities are great, but challenges are still great and numerous. I can also say that from Nonette, who's no longer here, she stressed that for this network, this emerging network, that there needs to be focus in terms of future interventions because many processes are at play at many levels. So in order to make the interventions and the actions effective, that has to be considered. In discussing, in the presentation of Director Lim, we see some promising developments at the level of ASEAN in terms of the discussion of biodiversity within the agriculture sector that also bodes well for wild foods. And also studies that are being done, especially on the links between indigenous knowledge, food, culture, customary practice, and tenure security. The main question there would then be in terms of mainstreaming and upscaling to policy processes of ASEAN, like in the development of guidelines and other policy processes. I have 2 takeaway points that we can continue to reflect on from the dialogue 1. And though Director Lim discussed many policy processes ongoing at the ASEAN level, especially cross-sectoral processes, I didn't hear one related to the theme of health and nutrition. So I'm thinking now, because everybody's top of the mind concern is about health, about immunity, about safety, how do we use that argument and cross-sectoral discussion to give more importance to this discussion of wild foods, local foods, traditional foods, in the food security dimension and in the livelihood and welfare dimension, especially of forest groups. So that's one question and could be a policy study on its own. And another is on the points that Nonette has raised, but has also come up in the questions, let's say from Adolfina, which was in the question and answer and has been answered. But how do we design common nationwide or region-wide policies that will be beneficial and not detrimental to communities, but that have a flexibility for local context implementation and design? Because that's also what we're seeing with food security and emergency plans, looking at imported products and GMOs and other things. So how do we promote national and regional policy that allows for flexibility and using Madhu's word, tailor-made approaches? And finally, we see a lot of progress within the regional realm in terms of agriculture sector, agroforestry sector, but wild foods within protected areas, wild foods within forestry and natural forests, these are areas where there continues to be conflict and where we need solutions, maybe not policy. Some are adverse to policy solutions, but definitely solutions among stakeholders, whether locally, nationally, or regionally. Thank you, Femi. Those are my takeaway points and some synthesis for Dialogue 1. And thank you also to the panelists.
Thank you, Chrissy. I'm looking at the time, but just to give some overarching points that I also picked up from the second session, the Dialogue 2, plus also some takeaways from the entire session, which was really, really rich. And to add that also to the equally rich discussions that have transpired already in the last 4 days, it's immense, it's overwhelming, both in terms of the positive. On the positive side of it, there's really a lot of interest and knowledge already coming out, and the generosity of sharing these and sharing also each other's outlooks for the future. So that's very encouraging. On the other hand, the immensity of the information that we're hearing now, it's also surfacing a lot of gaps still that maybe a future network will have to try and juggle and resolve, so that the two main takeaways that I heard recurring in this past week is really the centrality of the communities themselves, the indigenous peoples and local communities themselves, actioning their sovereignty, and also giving them the agency to really have the ownership for that knowledge around their food systems, and be able to have the agency to protect them, and also have the agency to also voice out in the policy arenas. In the Dialogue 2, it was encouraging indeed that there are opportunities that Dian had shared, Mr. Sma had shared, and even from the advocacy point of view, from the Farmers Association, a big Farmers Association already, they also come from this point of view of taking on these opportunities, policy entry points at the regional all the way up to global level. And these are quite, these are information that I'm sure some of our participants and some of our earlier speakers may not have known. And so this is something that, so in some ways, some of the points and recommendations that Madhu had shared earlier about going back down to the basics and trying not to be overwhelmed by science and not to be taken over by science, and yet we are hearing that science is required or science is necessary to also demonstrate our evidences on the ground. So these are kind of points that we need to be cognizant about, also in our efforts to move forward with good intentions. There could be also some danger points, possible conflicts or possible tensions. And moving forward, these are the things that we still have to work on. But overall, the sharing that has transpired from global level information all the way to local, and from local, very grounded, all the way to hopefully some of our regional and global actors can also take away with them. So yeah, balance, going back to the basics, going back to the idea that at the end of the day, harmony is what we really aspire for. So harmony in terms of local knowledge and science, harmony between local, regional, global, and a harmony between policy and practice. So I hope that it's not comprehensive enough probably to give justice also to all the presentations that have been provided today, but I hope it's good enough to take away with us and encourage us to keep on communicating with each other and build this network forward. So I would now leave us with a short video message from one of our conservation and food heroes from this morning's discussion with women and youth. I thought it was quite short and clear enough, again, of what the key message is for us moving forward. So I would give you Colleen Somonda's voice. She is, just a sec, sorry. Colleen Somonda's voice. Colleen is 21 years old, married, and has 2 children, is an active Higaonon youth of Siloo, Anangi, Itoy, Amosig, Higaonon tribal community located in Malitbog, Bukidnon in Mindanao at the southern Philippines. At the age of 31, she was married through Panuyo, a Higaonon tradition of couple matching. She was raised in Pulahon, Hagpa, in Pasugong. Her husband is a budding young chieftain. Colleen joined various online engagements about slow food movement, photo essay contest featuring Labo as her food entry that gained 1,000 likes and reactions. She's also the bookkeeper in a community-based enterprise that produces pure citronella oil. So let's hear the voice of Colleen.
Mahinungdanon ang tradisyonal nga pagkaon nga gikan sa lasang para kanako nga usa ka higaonon tungod kay kung tigutom o tigkaohol mauman ang among dali nga madaganan ug nakabase diri ang among panginabuhi, kultura o pagtuon sa tribo. Ang mga tradisyonal nga pagkaon nga among gakakuha sa lasang ug gakakaon hangtod karon mao ang labo, ubod sa ratan, ubod sa pula, usa, langgam, baboy halas ug uban pang mananap ug tanom sa yuta ug katubigan. Apan adunay babag nga among nasinati sa paggamit og tradisyonal nga mga pagkaon. Kontrolado na ang among panguha sa nagkalaing-laing mananap ug tanom sulod sa among lasang. Tungod sa balaod sa DNR dugang pa usapod kahagit nga ang mga kabatanunan karon dili na kaila ug kabalo mo kwisiso sa mga pagkaon, ang uban ila kining ikaulaw, ang pagkaon ug mga lagutmon, ambaw ug uban pa. Ang akong pangandoy nga ang mga kabatanunan matudluan sa mga tradisyonal nga pamaagi sa pagproseso niini nga mga pagkaon aron dili kini mawala ug mapadayon sa sunod nga henerasyon. Unta adunay panagtigom sa mga katigulangan ug mga kabatanunan aron hisgutan ang among IKSP sa pagkaon nga makita sa lasang. Inubanan sa suporta sa komunidad, LGU, NGO ug uban pang mga ahensya.
Okay, I think this is the part where I come in and then just close this out, wrap it up, no? So everyone, we really had a long but very productive discussion and a very enriching discussion. sorry we had to go over time, but we thank you all for staying, for those who are still here. This brings us to the close of all the main sessions for the week. But we have one last event tomorrow, so please join us again tomorrow 3 to 5 p.m. Manila time for Slow and Sustainable, the Future of Food webinar. This is a pioneering partnership with slow food networks in Indonesia, the Philippines, and India, with wild foods in the spotlight. You will learn a lot from this, and we hope you can still join us for this one more webinar for the week. And then maybe another announcement is, do feel free to visit our webpage for more updates about this week's event and summaries of the week's discussions and contributions from the Wild Foods, Biodiversity, and Livelihood Network. So visit www.wildfoodsasia.com. And finally, yes, so we're inviting you in advance to join us on the community-based NTFP Enterprises or CBNE Forum from 2 to 4 June 2021. So the event places community forestry enterprise in the spotlight, featuring best practices, cases, master classes, interactive competitions, community products on accredited online marketplaces, and launching some policy dialogue. So watch this out at ntfp.org for more news in the coming months. So finally, we ask everyone to turn on your videos for one more gallery photo. So I'll ask Christina to help us.
We're all tired.
But this just means that we need more time to dialogue, so we have to continue and keep on going. Maybe in the coming months, we continue this conversation regionally and nationally. So, Christina?
Thank you, Dazzle. All right, everyone, if you could kindly turn on your videos for me. I will be taking a couple of different shots. Please hold your poses. 1, 2, 3, smile. Continue smiling, please. 1, 2, 3. Let me take a couple more, just a second. Right, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, smile. And last one, 1, 2, 3. All right.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.
Have a good day. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, everyone. Have a good
to
rest
see
of
you,
the day.
Amy and Chrissy.
Claudia. Maria.
Hi,
Thank you.
Hi, Miss Joy. I just mentioned what.
Hi, Earl.
Hi, Dazzle.
Hello, Miss
Thank you for staying. Hi, Nat. Timothy. Carlo.
Salamat.
Thank you.